a round-table discussion in order to try and set the agenda for collaborations between Israel and India, Israeli institutions of higher education, and Indian universities and research institutes. We might discuss more general issues related to bilateral relations and more specific ones related to our own institutions and the way they could collaborate in a way which would be mutually beneficial, because if we do want this kind of collaborations to succeed, they have to be mutually beneficial. It can't be a unidirectional relationship. I've already met in several institutions here kind of suspicion as to, are you coming here in order to try and take our best students so they go and study in Israel, and would Israeli students come and study here? So it has to be a two-way relationship, and it shouldn't be limited to student exchange, but include other areas from joint degree programs to faculty member exchange, joint research projects, and the like. But this will be the second, so someone who is well experienced and well aware of both the opportunities and the challenges of academic cooperation between Israel and India. And indeed, the title of his paper is The Social Cultural Ties Between India and Israel. So, Nabrat, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ray. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Almost 1% of Israel's Jewish population Israelis. It has become a kind of rite of passage for Israelis to spend at least 6 months in India, after the completion of the conscription tenure. This phenomenon of Israeli tourism to India brings great benefits to the rural folk of the places they visit. Within quotes, from November until Passover, unquote, as Cohen points out, within quotation marks, Israelis flood cities like Manali and Kodaikanal by the thousands. As a result, entire communities have been rearranged to attract Israeli business. 300 rupees a night per room is my average rate for Israelis, says Samuel of the Vadakanal village in Kodaikanal. Another quote from him: if I put 3 Israelis in one room, that's 900 rupees a day. I have 4 rooms which earn me a total of around 3 lakhs. That is 300,000 rupees a month, unquote. An Israeli organization, Lev Olam, Heart of the World, ropes in Israeli backpackers as volunteers for a 10-day program aimed at providing training, transportation, shelter, and food to poor Indians in the major attractions for Israeli backpackers, such as Hampi, Pushkar, Rishikesh, and Dharmshala. Lev Olam collaborates with local NGOs to better target their projects where need is the greatest and to ensure the long-term feasibility of their efforts. It is hard to say if there is any country where love for Indian culture is as visible and omnipresent as in Israel. Israel is dotted with restaurants that serve Indian food. It is a common sight to see Israeli women sporting a bindi on their forehead, Indian dupattas for scarves, just as it is common to hear Bollywood numbers as mobile ringtones. Every major Israeli university offers courses in Hindi, which has emerged as one of the most popular foreign languages among the Israeli youth. Hindi Day is celebrated at Israeli universities with great fanfare. Indian studies, particularly as taught by the illustrious Professor David Schulman at the Hebrew University, hit an all-time high as backpackers emerged in a later reincarnation as students and philosophers of Hinduism. Writes Shalva Wild. The Israelis of the Bene Israel Indian Jewish community hosted the fourth World Conference of the Marathi language in Jerusalem in 1996. They also published a quarterly literary journal, My Boli, or Mother Tongue, in the Marathi language in the mid 1990s. The world's only Hebrew Haval is an Israeli singer and musician, Shai Ben Sur. Israeli, and he has released 2 albums of his fusion Sufi spiritual music. Israeli Indophiles have gone to the extent of developing a new type of New Age religion, incorporating elements of Hinduism as practiced in the ashrams of India, which combines meditation with Jewish practice. A 2008 Oxford University Press publication, edited by David Schulman and Shalva Weil, titled Karmic Passages, Israeli Scholarship on India, confirms that Indian studies in Israel have found a solid academic presence at her major universities. And all this is in spite of the fact that the two countries did not have diplomatic ties for more than 4 decades, following the birth of the modern Jewish state of Israel in 1948. It is also contrasted by Indian academia's apathy towards Israel and Jews. In sharp contrast to this Israeli love affair with India is India's attitude towards Israel, where Jewish and Israeli studies are non-existent in the academia, resulting in a hysterical ignorance about Jews and Israel. There is no, when we gain awareness of things, it is equally important to be aware of the level of ignorance. So there is no paucity of such Indians who think of Israel as a Muslim country, no matter how hilarious it might sound, and mistake Jews for Muslims or Christians or Zoroastrians. Of all the encounters I have had with Indians ignorant of Jews, the one that stands out is of a professor who headed the Department of Sociology at a university and was yet so unaware as to ask me if the Jews were a sect of Christians. When, when documentaries on Jews are dubbed in Hindi, those involved often fail to use Yahudi, the Hindi term for Jews, and continue to use the English word out of their ignorance. The only chair of Hebrew studies for some time was at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, and it remained vacant for a number of years because it was reserved for the visually challenged. Only when the seat was open for the general candidates could Dr. Khurshid Imam come to get appointed on that position, and it was later transformed into the position of assistant professor in the Hebrew language from a chair for Hebrew studies. So this was a big joke. And once a high-ranking official from the Embassy of Israel mentioned to me in a private conversation that we either have to find a visually challenged man who knows the Hebrew language, but that would be impossible. So the only thing possible would be to find somebody who knows the Hebrew language and blind him, so to qualify him to hold the position. Even at the universities that give courses in modern European history, no question is ever asked about the Holocaust in the examination. I'm not mistaking Holocaust studies with Israeli studies, but one has to acknowledge the strong link between the Holocaust and the Israeli history. When I asked the head of the Department of Western History at the University of Lucknow, Dr. Neena David, then head of the department, about it, she responded by saying, within quotation marks, since this is a topic which is part of the European history syllabus at the undergraduate level, we definitely discuss the Nazi persecution of the Jews popularly known as the Holocaust, which has also been denied by many people. But the fact is that Hitler did persecute the Jews. I do discuss it at length, but we don't generally ask questions specifically on the Holocaust in the examination. It is just a part of Hitler and the Nazis, about whom I teach in the class. It is just a small segment of it. I don't sort of magnify the Holocaust while I discuss the Nazis. I cannot spend so much time on only one aspect of the Nazis. I've never thought of setting a question on it, and neither have any examiners set a question on this. Until 2002, the Holocaust did not find mention in the standard history textbook in Gujarat, which discussed in detail the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. In response to complaints from the government of Israel, the textbook was revised to only vaguely mention that many Jews were killed during the war, without mentioning the Holocaust. When the present author organized a Holocaust films retrospective at two universities in Lucknow in 2009, it was misrepresented by a number of newspapers as a retrospective of films focusing on the Second World War. Resistance to Jewish and Israeli studies, and even to the study of Indo-Israeli relations, is in fact so strong in Indian academia that Professor P.R. Kumar Swamy has been wary of discussing his book India's Israel Policy, India as reflected, in a Facebook post of his posted on 21st September 2010. There is an absence of Indian gaze on Israel. Almost all Indian scholars focusing on Israel have been studying the relations between India and Israel, and not the Israeli society and culture. The only university in India to have a center devoted to Israeli studies is this university, Jindal Global University. And the only university to have courses in Jewish studies and Holocaust studies is Presidency University in Kolkata. It would be stupid to think of Indian academia without Islamic studies in India, without Islamic studies. Given the large numbers in the country and the astounding contributions to the nation. But the prominence of Islamic studies should not lead to the obfuscation and overshadowing of Jewish studies in India. In fact, there should be great interest in Indian Jews, given the fact that they are the smallest religious community in India. So minuscule in numbers that they do not even find mention as a separate community in the Indian census. A section of the Indian population is categorized under the title Others, and this section represents 0.7% of India's population, and Jews fall in that category. And if you precisely ask me about the proportion of Jews in India's total population, then that stands at 0.0004%. The estimates of the Jewish population in India vary from 3,000 to 10,000. And this variation stems from a number of reasons. One is that whether you should include the members of Judaizing movements that have emerged in the country in the second half of the 20th century and the 21st century as Jews. So this is one reason why there is great variation. The second reason is one's self-identification as Jewish. According to halakha, the Jewish oral law, anyone born of Jewish mother is Jewish. But not every such person would identify himself or herself as Jewish. How many of you would know that two of India's popular Bollywood actors are Jewish? Current Bollywood actors are Jewish, according to halakha, the Jewish oral law. Kunal Roy Kapoor and Aditya Roy Kapoor, sons of Salome Aaron, who was chosen Miss India in the year 1973. Miss India beauty pageant has been organized by the Times of India group And but in 1973, it was also organized by the Eve's Weekly women's magazine. It was then that this Jewish lady was crowned Miss India. Momentum Fund. Tata has also invested in a dedicated fund established by Tel Aviv University for Internet of Things technologies. Sun Pharma signed research collaborations with Technion University and the Weizmann Institute for developing drugs for oncology and brain diseases respectively. Several courses related to India are taught at Tel Aviv University, Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and Haifa University. Indian professors have been visiting Tel Aviv University under an MOU for a chair for Indian studies. Israeli academicians of repute have visited Indian institutes like IITs and GNU under the Gyani scheme. Very recently, Professor Shalva Weil, Professor Maoz were here at GNU conducting workshops. During the visit of President Rivlin to India in November 2016, 21 MOUs between Indian and Israeli academic institutions were also signed. Since 2012, Israel has been offering postdoctoral scholarships to students from India and China. Since then, 300 out of almost 400 fellowships have been awarded to Indian students. The government of Israel also offers 250 summer scholarships for Indian and Chinese students in chosen courses across Israeli universities. India offers 7 ICCR scholarships, that is Indian Council for Cultural Relations, this is what this acronym stands for, to Israelis every year. And an equal number of scholarships are offered by Israel for 10-month programs in specialized fields of study. In 2014, the Indian Diamond community set up a fund to finance study tours to India of meritorious Israeli students of Hindi. 18 Hindi students have benefited from these scholarships so far. Just one last point, I won't take more than a couple of minutes. To the best of my knowledge, the only Hebrew language poet who has been translated into Hindi and Urdu is Yehuda Amichai. In sharp contrast to this, Tagore and other Indian poets from the ancient age and have been translated extensively in Hebrew and also in Yiddish. There is a grudge among Jews, among the Ashkenazim, that Yiddish was given as stepmotherly treatment in the state of Israel. So those translations have often gone very unacknowledged and unrecognized. But the tradition of the translation of Indian literature into Jewish languages, Yiddish and Hebrew, is a very long one. It has a long history. But Indians haven't reciprocated this interest in any substantial way. So there is much that can be done, and the onus, the focus has to be on the blossoming of Jewish studies, because Jewish studies in its broad framework would automatically include Israeli studies, would automatically incorporate Israeli studies, and would also automatically incorporate Holocaust studies. So the rubric has to be broad and wide of Jewish studies. And there is a subfield within Jewish studies, that of Indo-Judaic studies. And there is a peer-reviewed journal devoted exclusively to it, published jointly by the University of Saskatchewan in Canada and Florida International University, and co-edited by Professor Nathan Katz and Professor Braj Mohan Sinha. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Something very specific about his paper. Otherwise, we move to the following paper, which is very different, and then we open up the discussion to look at different ways which could be used in order to promote a more substantial collaboration between India and Israel, between Indian universities and research institutes and Israeli universities. Okay, Ronnie, yeah.
Hindi will be it's their second language, right? It would be much more easy for them to read the translation in English. So also this question is like, it can be a beautiful aesthetic
think, look, nothing in India can actually reach the masses and can actually gain popularity unless and until it gets vernacularized. English is spoken only by 10% of India's population. And even with that 10% of Indian population, by the year 2025, there will be more English language speakers in India. Just as with just 2% of India's Christian population, the size of the Christian population in India is larger than the combined populations of Italy and France. So if you really want to reach the masses, you have to translate the Hebrew literature into Indian languages, into vernaculars.
Obviously, I was talking, and I agree, I'm talking more in academic context.
Well, even when it comes to academia, most of the Indian institutions, the medium of instruction is the vernacular, not the English language. And even where English, there are very few institutions in the country that have only English as the medium of instruction. I received my entire higher education at the University of Lucknow, which officially has a bilingual approach. All question papers have questions in both Hindi and English, and students enjoy the freedom to answer those questions in either.
Two more short questions. Danny?
It's not a short question, it's a short comment.
Short.
I understood your argument. Basically, the argument, if I understood correctly, the argument was Israel is extremely interested in India, and India is not as interested in Israel. It's a very broad argument, and I'm not sure that it's so easy to defend the argument. Maybe we can discuss it more. Because I think that the examples which you gave for the Israeli interest in India are debatable, and as well as the other side. I mean, you presented a certain picture in India, which I'm not sure that I fully agree to. You gave the example of Shai Benzu and the Kawalis, which I have my own opinion about. I think that Shai is a translator, apropos what I said about the translation. He provides the Kawali singers from Ajmer the opportunity to go out and perform outside of India. I think that Professor Anzi's Hindi classes in JMU are far more popular than the Hindi classes in Tel Aviv.
You mean his Hebrew classes?
His Hebrew classes, of course, sorry, in JMU are far more popular than in Tel Aviv. David Grossman, one of the foremost writers in Hebrew today, was the keynote speaker at the Jaipur Literature Festival last year. So I think that the picture is I think that the picture is more blurred than you try to.
Well, the students who have
And
opted for
just one more thing. In the Plato's Republic was translated to Hindi for the first time and published last year by Professor Alex Bataro. Plato's Republic. So can I present a paper suggesting that India is not interested in Greek philosophy? It was available there was a previous translation to Bengali and other translations to English. I think it's a great addition to have a Hindi translation.
There are innumerable commentaries in vernaculars on Greek philosophy, even if the entire works haven't been translated into the Indian languages. And as far as Afia Anzi's students are concerned, 99.99% of those students belong to the field of international relations. So interest in Israel in Indian academia has been confined largely to students of international relations. And the interest has been focused exclusively on Israel's foreign policy, in particular in the bilateral relations between India and Israel. There hasn't been any great interest in Israeli society and culture and its history.
Okay. One last question. Unless there's somebody who is very much interested in posing a question, you are most welcome to do so.
It's a very
I'm willing to be authoritarian with this side of the table and less authoritarian with this side of the table.
Just one small clarification of it, Professor. Did you mention that Dr. Zakaria, who translated those folk songs in Malayalam into this thing as Muslim?
No, I wasn't referring to that scholar. I'm aware of his work. He did that in collaboration with Ophira Gamaliel from the Hebrew University.
Yes.
I was talking of a person who is not a scholar. He is, by profession, he is a chef, but a very interesting character. He is the only Hebrew calligrapher in India.
Okay.
And the lady who is widely recognized as the matriarch of Cochin Jury, she considers him as her grandson. So it's a very beautiful bond between a Muslim and a Jew.
Dr. Zakaria is known to me, he is a Syrian Christian.
Yeah, well, he's a highly respected scholar.
Classical Syrian.
Yes, and he is certainly, thanks for bringing him up in the conversation, he is an exception among in Indian academia of a scholar who has focused on something related to Jewish culture in general. He has translated Judeo-Malayalam songs into English in collaboration with an Israeli scholar, Ophira Gamaliel. I completely forgot to mention him. That's my lapse. Thanks for bringing him up in the conversation.
Great. Okay, I will try to force you to take part in the discussion within 20 minutes or so, but now the microphone goes to Professor Nitzan Shaul, a professor in our esteemed School of Film and TV, and the chair of the Cinema Studies BA program. And I think that although it's his first visit to India, he has already been converted, and by now he's very much enthusiastic about the possibility of collaborating with Indian institutions. The title of
Israeli society, but I do have following Ronnie's presentation. There is hardly any presence of Indians in Israeli movies. There is one movie called Indian in the Sun, made by Ram Levy, where I won't go into that movie specifically, but it conforms to what you said in the sense that in this movie, the Indian hero is represented. First of all, Indian in the Sun refers also to being a Western, Indian in the Sun. But the Indian is presented as a sort of noble savage, as opposed to the Ashkenazi Jew that confronts him. And he's differentiated from a Mizrahi character, who is presented as a lower specimen of the East. So that's just a comment I have to make about.
So I have to interrupt. There are at least two more movies in which India is present in one way or another. One portrays an effort to play cricket someplace in the desert.
Turn left at the end of the world.
The end of the world to the left.
And another one has to do with a small moshav, a small, how should I say, cooperative, where they used to have an old cinema which showed the
Indian movies. Cinema Paradis.
There is yet another film. Okay. It is a story of Israeli backpackers in India. I can't recall its name.
Yeah. Okay, but sorry, but I interrupted.
Anyway, the presence, although as I find here to my surprise, how much interest there is in Israel towards India, apparently we can raise up more movies.
Yeah, but
and so
still,
on. But this is it's still a minor presence, I must say, in Israeli cinema. One more comment I have to say concerning your, and then I will bring it to my issue concerning your thesis or something that was discussed, is that before India it was South America for Israelis. In other words, Israelis go to India as they used to go to South America as a way to escape 3 years of army duty, a lot of pressures put on them, more than being interested. I mean, of course they become interested in the culture and so on, but the major drive of Israelis, of young Israelis to go to India is to get out of Israel. And this brings me to the subject of my presentation, which has to do with siege mentality in Israeli cinema. And I'd like to open with a quote. There are, 1,000 quotes that can verify my position, and I will not take the obvious quotes from the right of the map of Israel, but rather from Tzipi Livni, who is, center left. And in one of her addresses in a letter to President Bush, she said, "To be Jewish is to dream the Holocaust, to live the Holocaust, to die the Holocaust, without having been there. To be an Israeli child is to try and figure out the number 6 million and never comprehend it. Being a mother in Israel is to surprisingly find out that you passed on to your children the collective memory of the Holocaust experience. To want, on the one hand, to safeguard them from the pain accompanying the memory burden you had to carry, and on the other hand, to want them, their children, and their children's children to always remember. To be a leader in Israel is to think whether you, if you had been there, would have seen the writing on the wall, and whether you would have made the right decision on time. It is to understand the burden of responsibility, and most important of all, to swear to never forget." So this is a clear expression of dominant discourse and of siege mentality. And briefly defined, and the concept was developed by Daniel Bartal from Tel Aviv University, is the Israeli siege mentality of being a besieged nation is a mental predisposition of Israeli Jews, framing the comprehension of issues related to this mentality. There is a joke that says that if you're paranoid, it doesn't mean that you're not being persecuted, okay? But being paranoid means that you're always under the thought that you're being persecuted. And siege mentality is not a mental illness, but it is a predisposition of Israeli Jews towards issues related to, the safeguard, to the state, to the safeness of the state and the stability of the state. It often leads, among other things, to a selective approach to data, to inside pressures to conform, and suspicion of fifth columns, which is now spreading in Israel, and may lead to overreaction of threats. This siege mentality, framing the way most Israeli Jews, left and right, perceive their situation, has many consequences, which are not necessarily very positive. The sources of siege mentality are religious. We have the notion of a people apart. We have the notion of there's no one else to rely upon except God. And there is the notion of the historical Amalek, the ahistorical Amalek, the people that want to destroy the people of Israel. For example, Iran is now the present-day Amalek in Israeli discourse, and so on, Hitler and so on. And of course, another source is the long history of anti-Semitism culminating in the Holocaust, and it also is, as I quoted, the dominant ideology of the Israeli state. It is inculcated through the education system, through commemorative days. It is embedded in cultural products such as films. And here I come to my story. What I want to deal with, siege in films or in art in general, I would describe it. It has formal and thematic expressions, particularly in films on war, but not necessarily. You have claustrophobic and agoraphobic compositions, labyrinthine alleys, enclosed spaces, shadowy locations, sudden eruptions of violence, conspiracy-type narratives, circular or fatalistic stories, focus on persecuted groups or isolated individuals, mistrust between characters. All these forge a film reality that frames through a besieged perspective the events that are depicted, turning into dead-ended and irresolvable. Now I'd like to take you through a brief tour of Israeli films on war, which will also give you a notion of some shifts in Israeli society throughout the years. So this is like a brief tour on Israel. Yeah. And I've divided my discussion, I'll do it briefly, into 4 periods. Each centered around a particularly important movie of that period that represents the mentality, the overall mentality of Israelis towards that specific war dealt with at the period when the movie was made. And the first period would be from 48, from the year of independence to 67, all the way to 67. The second would be between 67 and the political overturn in 77. The third would be from 77 to 2000, rather the eruption of the Al-Aqsa Intifada, roughly. And the last one will be from 2000 to the present, these broad strokes. So I will start with the first period, 48 to 67, and I will focus my discussion on a film called Hill 24 Doesn't Answer. Hill 24 Doesn't Answer is a film from 1956, and it addresses the War of Independence. The historical context, briefly, is it's right after, the War of Independence was the most cruel war Israel had. The second was the Yom Kippur War, or the Day of Atonement War. But the Day of Atonement War is considered to be a defeat, although it was a victory, whereas 48 is considered a victory, so it's not that, I would say, traumatic as was the 73 war. So we have in 556, we're after a very cruel war. A lot of people have died for independence, and the doubling of the population within 3 years of Israel's establishment. The population was doubled. Imagine a situation where in India, 1 million come in 3 years, So it changes the whole notion of what Israel is, and it poses to the government a very serious problem to deal with. So you have an outside situation of a war experience as very dangerous, and on the other hand, you have an inside total shift of everything. So Ben-Gurion decided with Mapai party to form a very centralist and strong government to try and control. He sent the new immigrants, most of them from Arab countries, some of them Holocaust survivors, but most of them from Arab countries, to build the roads, to give them, first of all, means of subsistence, but also to lower poor paying jobs, and they were sent to the borders, to populate the borders and so on. And this created the problem during the 50s, the correlation between class and ethnic origin, which subsists more or less until today. The concept of the Israeli worker, which was the dominant sabra before the state, the Israeli-born sabra was a worker, a socialist worker. After independence, it turned into a citizen and a soldier. This was the main idea, and this concept was consolidated into the conception of the 48 War of Independence. Now, if we look at Hill 24 Doesn't Answer, which is a very interestingly structured movie, you can see that maybe we'll show the beginning of the movie and then I'll start talking. So show me one. Hill 24 number 1. There's no image.
On May 14, 1948, the State of Israel.
So you have both a beginning conveying the notion that Israel is or is on the brink of destruction or was already destructed, and it ends at that point. All right. So we have a circular formation, and then the movie basically is composed of 3 flashbacks that go back and tell the story of each of the protagonists, except the Yemenite woman, and this is another issue that I won't go into at this point. But it gives you flashbacks, 3 flashbacks, what happened, how each of these heroes got involved in the War of Independence, and eventually found his death on Hill 24 Doesn't Answer. So you have this circular structure. Maybe we'll show the end. And no, that would be, I think, the second. I arranged it so that.
I don't speak.
No.
What you accuse me?
Sorry.
Who are you anyway? You too loud.
The other one. When they were moving vectorially, they were in darkness, moving forward. Here, there's a shift from dark to light, and there is sort of the idea of in their death they gave us the country or they gave us our life, and the movie then both uses a circular structure and a vectorial structure. And this represents, the circular structure is the siege mentality structure. The vectorial structure says something different. It says, well, this was the past, and now we move to a future where we'll be normal in the region, and you know, you see the UN officer, the Israeli officer, the Jordanian officer coming together and talking about the solution. And then the movie starts. After this, you see aerial shots of the country, and the caption, the beginning, goes on top of the movie. And so, in other words, the conception of the War of Independence during the 50s was that it was dual. First of all, this is the last war of the Jews. Now we have become a nation, we are normal, and we become normal in the region. But the other one is, this is just one more instance of the ongoing attempts at annihilating the Jewish people, and this is just another war in the history. So this dual conception is that of the 50s. It is related to the War of Independence, seen as both, you know, the old Jew has gone, the new Jew is here, and on the other hand, despite we are new, they want to destroy us as they always did. Let's jump now to the war, the 6-Day War. This is the second period, and the mentality of this period towards war extends for a decade, from 67 to 77. As you know, the 6-Day War, before the 6-Day War, there were 2 years that were called the waiting period. All right, because Israelis were facing mass demonstrations in Egypt, mostly headed by Nasser and his pan-Arabism, and the idea that Israel has to be destroyed. And we don't know yet what were really his plans, whether he would have, you know, put that into effect. But in any way, the Israeli government so they are on the brink of destruction, and they initiate the 6-Day War. The 6-Day War, being a 6-Day War, also got, you know, religious dimensions, like, you know, God made the world in 7 days. Now we broke all the siege we were under. We expanded our borders. We have become like an empire in the region. We can breathe now. And after the depressing waiting period, this period is marked by what we can call a euphoria. You know, there was a euphoria in Israeli society, and euphoria is something that gets you blind to what's going on, all right? So I would say that this euphoria blocked or was responsible both for what happened in the 73 war, Day of Atonement war, and a euphoria that blinded the Ashkenazi elites in particular to what's going on in society, and was one of the major factors leading to the 77 overturn. So this is the period I'm blocking now, and I want to talk about the movie Siege. The movie Siege was made in '68, and it deals with War Widow. So you have a shift of meaning in this composition, but let's see now this clip, which shows the shift that I was talking about, from collectivism to individualism. I think the last one, we jump to 2000 till now, and I want to focus on Bufo. It's a movie about the Lebanon War, which became eventually the first Lebanon War. The historical context is first and foremost the Al-Aqsa Intifada, the terrible, the terrible suicide bombings, and the repercussions of the Israeli army, a terrible situation, failed peace processes, and then you have the Second Lebanon War. This period is very, for Israel, it is very traumatic to begin with, and what we see is that this war, the First Lebanon War, in 3 films, by the way, I'm focusing on Bufo, but there was also another movie called Lebanon and another called Wars with Bashir. In all these 3 movies, war is framed through a siege mentality, which is exasperated by a feeling of irresponsible and careless leadership. This is a new twist of a leadership that cannot be trusted. So let's see three clips and
Okay. Once again, I'm the bad guy.
yeah, well, you are. Okay, this is first of all to give you a notion of claustrophobic formation in the movie. They are, can you freeze for a moment just to give a context? This is about soldiers holding a post on the Bufor mountain. They are isolated on the mountain, being shelled all the time from all around. There's sitting ducks there, okay? And this is the movie. It's right before they leave Lebanon. Israel leaves Lebanon, and by the end of the movie, they're supposed to blow up the compound. Let's see now. This is I want to show you three clips. One is to show you the formation of claustrophobia through this maze. The second one is the notion of agoraphobia, and the third one has to do with we can't trust our leaders anymore. So let's see this one first.
European culture via Israeli films.
I would be most interested in doing so
Okay,
at my university.
okay. You are going to Calcutta next time. To Presidency University. First questions as to Nitzan's paper, the siege mentality, these various movies he has used in order to argue that in a way the same pattern keeps going on and on. Israel has gone through so many wars and crises, but still it's the same early state mentality of siege. Ilan, I see that you are anxious to ask something.
Actually, I'm enjoying this a great deal. No, I'm listening.
Okay. No, it seemed that you
I
were.
have a question.
Okay, later. Okay. Who wants to be the first one? Yeah, go ahead.
So the army, taking a slightly different angle to this. The army is seen in Israel and has been seen as especially because of the land of immigrants. Especially since the land of immigrants.
Yes.
The idea being that everybody from Hungary to Alaska, anybody who joins the army, that's a great leveler. And everybody joins the army, everybody becomes the same at the end of the day.
Melting pot. Cool.
Melting pot, right? The entry into Israeli society, yes. Does this kind of now the not so cohesiveness in the army with openly public displays of disagreements within the military, etc. Is it also a reflection of how Israeli society is also getting split up? Is the army the first casualty of that, the first, let's say, visible malice of that situation?
Well, it's not the army causes casualties. It's not a casualty. Yes, the army definitely reflects what's going on in Israeli society, and Israeli society is a very splintered society now, as Indian society is, from what I gather. Therefore, the siege mentality as an ideology is being, one of the reasons it is so prominent now is because Israel is being seen as disintegrating, and the army reflects that. Right?
It's certainly not the first casualty. If you look at the education system, for example, especially at the primary level, by now less than 50% of Israeli kids go to the secular go to secular public schools. The rest go to either religious, ultra-religious, school, Israeli schools, etc. So
Private schools.
Yeah, private school. So no, the armed forces are certainly not the first one, but in a way among the last ones to go to this polarization and these tensions.
But having this position as the primary grade leveler is, the last great hope, so to say, of leveling
The army is still, most of the budget of Israel goes, not most, but a large portion of the budget goes to the army, to maintain the army, and so on. So it's in that sense, it's a very strong institution, the strongest institution in Israel. But it is undergoing. It reflects all these changes. There is a big problem with, or a big. I don't know if it's a big problem, but there's a big discourse about the religious people going, the ultra-Orthodox, going or not going into the army. There is also, the army also represents through different units. It represents different ethnicities. There are Golani or Givati, which are regiments that are mostly populated by lower income Israelis, and then you have the paratroopers and so on, which are, so it's
Okay, next question. Ilan.
Hi. It's just such a fascinating phenomenon. I love what you've done. Just think, Amos Oz doesn't make you necessarily feel happy. Certainly David Grossman doesn't make you feel happy. It's a very, very special phenomenon. And in terms of films, it's not like you have a market of 300 million people as you do in the United States, with 1 billion people as you have in India. It's a relatively small market for Hebrew films, and it's supported by the government, by national institutions. It isn't by the sale of tickets. It isn't a different kind of entrepreneurship. So you have a situation where the establishment, if you like, supports films that are critical of the same society and of its policies. So you have kind of a national institutionalization of, to use the good Hindi word of kvetching, which is another word of complaining, of being critical. And that's really a very special characteristic of Israeli society. I could also do the same thing in American films and American art. Roth, the great contemporary Jewish writer in the United States, is Shabbat. And
my opinion. Anyway, may I just remind you of Pachin, yes, 1970 Martin. Yeah.
My students, I have to tell you. Manoj Kumar, you know them? Know him? Okay. You don't know. When I take the name of Rajendra Kumar, I
Yes.
said, who is this? What are you talking about?
So Manoj Kumar. Okay, not the opening scene, but just after Bharat steps down the stairs at the airport and gets accepted and sees the family of NRI, the horrible picture of the family of NRI, okay, which is both a locus of desire, okay, the space that is outside, and also the locus of horror, okay. So he meets the father and he meets the son that wears like a hippie, calls himself orphan, yes, and he meets the wife smoking on him and the daughter that he's going to marry eventually, right? In order to in order to restore order. Okay, pretty, yes. And just straight after it, there's this series of collaborations simply because we started the program only in 2015, the undergraduate program. So we're working on collaborations, 3+1 or, or 2+2, whichever way it works out.
so maybe 2+2 would work better for us.
Yeah, we do have 2+2 with universities in the US and Canada, but definitely we are looking at it.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
But would any student like to say something more?
Maybe introducing.
India, China, we've got a strategic places in the world. And beyond that, you have American Jewish Committee, but that really requires research. I just can't throw out names. One would have to be talking to individuals. Think of a few individuals who will speak. But I would start with Itamar, his assistant, the man who works in the office, with Dr. Ariel Roth. ROTH, Ariel Roth is the executive director. It all comes back to Itamar anyway.
So besides the declarative aspect, I think that he really became a better philosopher during his month in Germany, and probably would be the same vice versa. Actually, I was sorry that we didn't have students panel in this conference. It would be interesting to listen to students. I guess that it needs again, it needs funding.
We heard earlier today about the cost per visit. Immediately, there's no need for any formal agreement. You have an experience with this already. Exactly. So if you look here for a course supervisor from Israel for a thesis or dissertation on a topic related, I'm sure we can find somebody at our end. If it's something related to Israel, surely Orit Rosin will be happy, and there are other scholars. Depends on the topic. Yeah. But this is something that we could implement immediately. Just a matter of, making sure that we are all aware of this possibility, and that's it.